Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Return Missionary Next Chapters podcast. I am your host, Sid Bassett. In today's episode, we dive into a lifelong journey of a former mission president and very seasoned missionary, Jeff Redd. Jeff has served in Peru, Mexico, Kenya, and beyond. Today, Jeff shares invaluable insights into the raw realities of mission life, proving that an imperfect beginning can blossom into a deep, abiding conversion built on humility and authenticity. Jeff's stories offer profound reminders that mission readiness is not defined by a ticking clock, but rather a prepared heart. He talks about the need to be prepared, even when pressures might suggest leaving earlier. Jeff highlights what it truly means to be ready to serve and what service to God looks like with or without a mission tag. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's good to be here with you.
We're going to start off by time traveling just a little bit. Could we go back in time? You're not that old, so I'm not going too far back. But can we go back to when you served your first mission? Tell us where you served. And when you were young, did you always want to serve a mission?
Well, it was a long time ago, Sid. It was 50 years ago last week. Served in the Peru-Lima mission. But to get there, I had to spend 3 months in what was called the language training mission in Provo, now the MTC, and help to construct the MTC of those days after we stopped learning our lessons. And then I went for 3 more months to the San Antonio mission in Texas to wait for a visa. So by the time I got to Peru, I'd been serving for 6 months.
What did your mission mean to you? What were the takeaways if you and I were having a quick conversation and I asked, how was your mission in Peru and Texas?
Well, I think I learned how to be a missionary back in that first mission. The basics, how to teach, how to work hard, how to knock a million doors, how to get hot and dusty, and, all those real life things of being a missionary. It was a lot of work, and the few people that we did bring into the church were solid and still are, many of them. Of course, back in the day, we didn't have the internet and email and social media to keep contact with people. But once Facebook got invented, some of those people that I did baptize have contacted me and still remain in contact.
Wow.
So it's very satisfying to see that 50 years later, that people I taught are still solid in the church. They're sending their grandchildren on missions. And to me, that's one of the very satisfying parts of my service from so long ago.
No, I'm impressed with you. I'm impressed that you had that kind of deep relationship with some of the saints there in Peru. I served years after that as an 84, 86 missionary. And I honestly have lost contact with most of the people I taught. So I'm really impressed that you didn't have social media, but then when you did get it, you went and tracked down some people. So good on you. And it's great that you've maintained those relationships. So now the question I have for you, and we ask almost all of our guests is did you always want to serve a mission?
I think I always knew I would be a missionary.
Okay.
My dad had served in a mission in Mexico and Guatemala back in the early 1950s. And I remember many times we'd say, Dad, get out the slides. We want to see the pictures. And he had stories, and I could tell how much he loved his service as a young missionary. And so I think I always wanted to have that kind of experience. I think although Dad was from California, I think he thought he should have been born in Mexico because he was Mexican at heart. And he kind of just made us, all the 3 boys in my family served Spanish missions, and it was just part of our family culture.
I think that's great. We're going to talk about this later, but the readiness of a missionary is very important. And what did you think were the key elements of your readiness to go out? I assume you went when you were 19 or 20?
I did. I went when I was 19. I was ready as much as somebody can be ready at 19 back in those days. I went to seminary for 4 years. I felt like I had what I later called a generic testimony. When back in those days, we had flip charts that we would teach from. There were pictures, and there was a script that we memorized in Spanish, and there were little asterisks in the script. You're noticed to turn the page, so to speak. And I remember very specifically, we called it Charla F. It was the lesson about the atonement. And I remember sitting there, turning the pages, and having a profound experience, gaining a true testimony of the atonement, teaching myself the gospel. Now, that sounds funny that I already knew the church was true, but that's when it became very personal to me. When I saw those pictures of Jesus kneeling in Gethsemane, picture of him hanging on the cross and the picture of him leaving the tomb, it became very real. And then I had a real excitement to go and actually do what missionaries do instead of just have a mission experience. I hope that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. That's beautiful, actually. Thank you for sharing it that way. Previously you had said that you were raised in the gospel, but your conversion to the gospel of Jesus Christ, that comes with work. That comes with effort. It just isn't
Right.
given to you. Did you find that you received your deepest conversion on your mission?
Oh, for sure. Well, conversion is continuous, obviously, and
Uh,
it needs to continue your whole life. But I remember very specifically, my parents put me on a plane in Los Angeles to Salt Lake. It wasn't like, it later became where it became the whole neighborhood and every relative you ever knew went to the MTC back in the day and dropped you off. My parents put me on a plane, and I remember having the thought on the plane to Salt Lake. My parents are well-respected people where I live. Everybody knows them. Everybody respects who they are and what they stand for. But I'm going to get into the mission field, and I'm somebody that nobody knows, and I need to kind of be my own self, and I have to stand on my own testimony, my own knowledge. I just can't stand on my parents' reputation and testimonies anymore. And I think that kind of insight that I had on the plane, getting off the plane and trying to figure out how to get myself to Provo on a shuttle, it was kind of one of those moments where you think this is real.
yeah. Well,
Uh, So that's when it became real. That's when like I say, the generic testimony became very, very personal in those first few weeks at the MTC.
I love that. So you go through your mission and you come home. Another question I often will ask return missionaries is, what were those first few days and months like when you returned from your mission, your first mission?
I think I had more culture shock coming home than I did going to Peru. You hear people talk about their missions in third world countries and how difficult things are by the standard of living, the poverty that you see, and so forth. I just relished what I saw in the Peruvian culture, and even though it wasn't what I was used to, it was very wonderful to see how different people lived in a different part of the world. But the harder part was coming home and seeing how things were at home and the abundance that we had. I almost had a sense of guilt, like, why do we have so much? We don't need so much. I remember very specifically in Peru getting very angry one day at a ward mission leader who didn't show up for our meeting. And I was a little gripey to his wife, and I said, "Where is he? He said he'd be here." And she said, "Well, he went out to sell the wheels off our truck so we would have money to buy medicine for our son who's sick." And I was put in my place.
Mm, boy, that does wake you up to reality, doesn't it? When you see
Yeah,
the lives and sacrifices of others, and it's very humbling.
yeah.
Yeah, it's probably just
And
as
I
well you. Yeah, go ahead.
saw the faithfulness and love that this man had for his son, and it kind of jolted me to think, wow, people in Peru lived like that back in those days where they would actually have to make real sacrifices for their families. And I got home to the abundance that we all enjoyed at home, and I think it changed me in how I thought about material things, even for the rest of my life, when you live in that and see the faithfulness of people who live that way.
Mm. Well, it does change you, and it's changes you for the better. I know. So let's go back to that change. You came back. You said it was a hard adjustment. You presumably had goals. You're good at that, right? Setting goals are important to a missionary. Did you always know you wanted to go to law school? Did you always know you wanted to get married in the temple? What were those sort of goals that you knew were the next steps of your life?
Sid, you might remember because I'm not that much older than you. Back in the day, I think that there was clarity that we knew very clearly that we would serve missions, we'd come home, get an education, get married, and start a family. That was just kind of the pattern of expectation. So I think just being obedient, I thought, I'm going to go home and I'm going to get back in school. I'd had a year at BYU before my mission. So I didn't really struggle with the idea of what next. What next was going to be going back to school, getting my degree, finding a wife to get married in the temple and to start a family. And I met Janine at the first family home evening that we had back at BYU. And I won't tell the story of dating her roommate for a while before I actually started dating her. But I recognized very soon that she was somebody special. And it was maybe I'd been home about 2 years by the time we got married. but I knew clearly that's what I wanted to do next. And I think that's just how we were raised in those days. Those of us who went on missions, we knew we'd come home, get an education and whatever it might be, and get married and start our families. So I didn't know I wanted to be a lawyer. That came later in my educational process, but that's how it worked for me.
And it is okay to have that model. It's okay. I mean, I know sometimes even as a mission leader, and you would know this, you want to give that same pattern to somebody else, right? It worked for you. You could see it working for them. But everyone's very different and everyone has a different situation at home. Their social situation is going to be different. And so you want to focus on those really key important elements of what they learned on their mission and say, take that with you, keep your studies, keep your habits, keep those things focused on the Savior Jesus Christ. And if marriage comes around, don't throw it away, take the
That's
opportunity.
right.
And if it
Right.
happens, great. And it's a blessing if it does. But if it doesn't, that could be a blessing as well for you. So, thank you for sharing
There
that.
and I recognize too that many of my Peruvian companions did not even have the opportunities that I had. There weren't universities they could attend, or there weren't professional programs or those kinds of things they could have. And our experience in Africa reinforced that to me. So many wonderful, faithful returned missionaries come home and then simply don't have the opportunities. So I think it puts a greater obligation on those of us who do have those opportunities to not squander them so that we can be in a position by employment, by experience to help others who aren't so blessed.
Yeah,
I just think that's super important.
I agree with you entirely. And it is ours to share that. I'll call it privilege. I know privilege can mean different things to different people, but we had a privilege. We had a path. We had opportunity and we had means for the most part. And so when we got back and were able to follow that path, good things can happen in that situation. But what comes with that is the responsibility to give back to others. And there are many who don't have that, like you experienced. And again, we're fast forwarding again at a fast pace here. So I really want to delve into this question you and I have talked about. Our church leaders have consistently taught us that every worthy and able young man should serve a mission. And as you point out to me, it's always paired with the call to become and stay worthy. And of course, all sisters who choose to serve are equally welcome and celebrated. And in the mission we serve, we had majority sisters. So we're grateful that they all chose to serve a mission. But here's the question. What does it mean to be ready for a mission? And what happens when somebody's not ready? What do you do? And I remember you telling me a story about a missionary who did have to go home early for readiness. It wasn't really worthiness. It wasn't because they had done something that, was inexcusable. It was rather they just didn't have the testimony. Could you tell us more about that? I'd like to explore that a little bit with you.
Well, sure. I go back to my own experiences. I told you a little bit ago about I was ready because I had a generic testimony, but I really wasn't ready with a burning in my bones kind of testimony that I could preach the gospel, like they taught Brigham Young. You remember he talks about the missionaries with the fire in their bones, and I was
Yeah.
not that way. I don't know any young missionary or any senior missionary who is that way when he starts. So in that sense, I don't know if any of us are really ready until we really humble ourselves and let the Spirit work through us and let the Lord work on us and let our leaders work on us and teach us how to do it. But I think if a young person comes into the field, as this young man that you allude to came without a testimony, he didn't have a testimony of the basics that God is our Father and Jesus Christ is his Son and our Savior. He didn't even know that. It made it very difficult for him to do what missionaries do. But I have to comment that he showed integrity, that he told me that he would teach the lessons in the sense of this is what our church teaches, but he would turn to his companion to testify because he didn't feel like he could honestly testify to the truth of what he taught. So that made it very difficult for him, but I commended him on his integrity he wasn't going to lie to anybody. He taught this is what our church teaches. So we decided, and it should be clear that no mission president ever sends a missionary home. You know that no missionary goes home unless there's several general authorities who have considered the situation and prayerfully and by revelation determined that that missionary should go home. And he went home, and he had to face a situation at home where the parents were not happy that he was returning. and probably the community was going to judge him and those sorts of things. But I have to honor his courage and honesty to tell me that he just didn't have a testimony. But the sweet part of that story, Sid, is years later, one of my former assistants let me know that he'd run into this fellow and that he'd gone back to church and said, I'm totally active. I've gone to the temple. I have a testimony. And so that triggered the thought in me that maybe I should contact him and see how he was doing. And he told me, thankfully, he says, I'm so thankful that I went home when I did so I could prepare myself like I should have prepared before I went on the mission, but to gain a testimony of the truthfulness of the gospel. So I know it doesn't always happen that way, but for him, it was the most wonderful timing, not a traditional timing, but to gain the testimony after he went home early and to be solid in the gospel, as far as I know, even now. So each of us has to do it our own way. There's no one way that everybody does it. But I think it's helpful if we go with more than, well, we have to at least know the basics before we go.
Well, I
Otherwise, I
think,
don't think
yeah,
we're really rich.
I think you called it sort of a generic or a framing of a testimony that you're going
Right.
with, and hope. I guess hope, faith, and hope that it would augment during your time as a missionary, and in fact, that's what it did, and became a deep and abiding testimony within you, and that conversion became very deep. I
Yeah.
want to go back to this question because I've struggled with this as well. As a mission leader, you want anyone and everyone who's called by a prophet of God to come to your mission, right? You want them, you love
Right.
them before they even arrive. You just love them. You feel like they're your own, though I know they're not, but they feel like your own. And it's been said that missionaries are called to mission leaders as much as to missions. And it feels like that missionary was called to the right mission with the right mission leader who could listen to the promptings of the Spirit and see the integrity in his own heart. He was honest, but through his honesty, he still made his way on a mission. I mean, there's a lot of
Yeah.
boxes that have to be checked or buttons that have to be pushed, before somebody actually gets that call and gets called on a mission. They open the call. I don't know if they were alone or with a lot of people, but there's a lot that went on to get that missionary in the mission field. And then after he gets on the mission field, he realized I don't have enough to get me through. And I'm just speaking what I read, not what I feel. And that's not helpful because it can actually be hurtful for an individual in that situation. And so what happens? I'm going to call you president in this scenario. I never was your missionary, but what happens, president, when and let's say you're a stake president or a bishop, and you have a young man or a young woman, let's say a young man in this case, because that was the example you gave, that just says, you know what, I want to go, but I don't know what I would do because I don't have a real testimony. I don't have that framework. I don't feel ready to go on a mission. What do you tell them? And then the follow-up question to that is, do they now have a place in their ward? Do they feel that it's okay to say I need to wait or I need to defer or I need to maybe even indefinitely, defer? What do you do with that young man? And I'm using young men. I could use young women. I'm doing that because of the mandate as a priesthood holder to go and serve. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say first that there's really not an urgency to get an 18-year-old boy on a mission the day he graduates from high school. I mean, he can. If you go back and listen to President Monson's talk in General Conference when he announced the age change, he didn't even suggest that everyone should do it, but they can. So then I think, well, then we need to do all we can to have people be ready that if they choose to go on their 18th birthday, the day after they graduate from high school, then that would be okay. But I think we just need to be patient as parents, as leaders, as fellow ward members, to not put the time pressure on the youth to go before they're ready. There's something in our culture that just wants to run them out the door and say, oh, look, they're on a mission. It would be much more helpful for them to have something to say once they get there. And I'm flashing back to a zone conference we had in Mexico that was one of my favorite zone conferences, actually. We found a talk by President Ballard, who was like the missionary of the century, as you know, before he passed away. He just was one of the greatest missionaries of our generation. And he told the story of going to England, arriving in London, and going the very first day to Hyde Park, London, to Speaker's Corner, with a group of missionaries. Maybe you've heard this story, and I'll give you the shortened version. I don't want to get the details wrong, but he's standing around seeing somebody on a soapbox preaching something, and he didn't think that he would be the one to called on to be next. And the mission president was there and said, "Okay, Elder Ballard, it's your turn. Get on the box and preach." And he got up and he spoke for less than a minute and ran out of things to say and stepped down totally embarrassed that he didn't really have anything to say. He didn't have anything really in his heart to testify to try to convert the people of London to his message. And it hit him that he had to have a message in his heart that he was ready to share. And so what we did, just as kind of a play act in Mexico, I got some buckets, and I got a bucket for each companionship. And I said to one elder, "Stand on the bucket, that's your soapbox." And then the command was, "Preach." And I paused, like, what's going to come out of your mouth? You have an audience. What are you going to say? And that was just an eye opener for so many of us, Sid, because we got to have something in our heart that we're urgently wanting to tell the world as a missionary. Now, granted, when you get on the plane to Salt Lake, like I did, you don't yet have that in your heart. And many of my missionaries didn't, but we need to help develop that so that if they're given 20 minutes to give a talk in sacrament meeting, they actually have something meaningful to say about the gospel of Jesus Christ, about how they feel about him, about how they feel about the atonement, and how they feel about Joseph Smith and the restoration. And those ought to be the basics that we as parents and leaders and fellow church members, bishops, stake presidents, whoever it might be, help those young people to have something in them to say.
Oh, I love that. You need to have something that you feel and that you've received some level of a testimony or conversion. And if you do, then you don't mind sharing it. I say that, but I lived in London for 8 years, and I literally walked to Hyde Park right past Speaker's Corner almost every work day for those 8 years. And I remember thinking, if somebody put me on a soapbox and said, "Go to preaching," I don't know. I like to think that because I didn't have my tag, I didn't have that setting apart or calling to do that, but it takes a lot of courage.
Right.
And I love your recommendation. Just practice. Just get up and share what you know, because nobody can knock you off of that position. That's what you know and you feel. And just practicing that is a really good idea. And speaking of readiness, that may be a good approach for all to do. And I know in the MTC, they really try to do that as well.
I could add to that story of the zone conference that shortly after, one of the elders sent me a picture of his companion standing on a park bench in a plaza in a little town in Mexico doing just that. And another elder stood on another bench in another town plaza. So they got the idea that, you could do that. I remember in Peru, in a town that I opened up just before I came home, the missionaries had never been there. And there's a stake there in that town now. We did just that. I went up and stood on a bench and had my companion collect names and addresses of the people who were listening, like, would you like us to come to your house and do this? I'd read Parley P. Pratt's autobiography, and was inspired. Wow, if they did things like that in the old days that were successful, why couldn't we try those kind of things? So there's a certain boldness that comes with experience. As you know, I wouldn't have done that the first day out, but near the end of my young mission in Peru, I was standing on park benches too.
It's great. In Spanish, right? In a different language.
Yeah.
And you learn Spanish, you learn the language of the spirit, and you put those together with your missionary mandate, and you just go to town. I mean, any return missionary, as a high counselor, when I got back, I would take any one of them with me, and they just had so many amazing things to share. And they weren't just stories, they were deep, converted messages of doctrine, sound doctrine that they were sharing. And I remember thinking, what happened to you? I mean, I didn't even know you before you left. There's no way this was you. And now look at you. So, well, look, our time is flying by and I've had a delightful time already, but there's a few topics I do want to bring up with you. So you come back from your mission. It was a tricky one. And there's one story maybe we'll tell if we get some time about when you were there and as a lawyer, how helpful that was. But you come back and then you decide to serve another mission. Can I just say thank you to you and Janine, your amazing companion. Thank you for being willing to come home and then go back. I mean, we've only been home for less than a year, and I think my mind is still at rest, right? Trying to just get my head around what we missed of those 3.5 years. But you turned around and did it again. I just want to commend you for that. And obviously, as a consecrated disciple of Jesus Christ, you'd say that's just what I do or what we do. But there's a conscious decision there that you're going to do that. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you. I know you got to know my brother and his wife while you were there, and they had amazing things to say about you. That's a big assignment to go to Nairobi. What did you learn about your own conversion, about the saints there, about what they endured, the sacrifices they made? What would you share with us about that experience in serving with your wife in Africa?
Oh my gosh, where do I start? Let me just back up a little bit. With every missionary who I sent home from Mexico at the end of his mission, of course, you have that last interview with your missionary. And we talked always about purpose. As full time missionaries, we know what our purpose is every day. We get up every morning, we know pretty much what the Lord wants us to do. We study, we pray, we exercise, we eat a healthy meal, and then we go out and spend the day out looking for people to teach the gospel to. And I would always counsel the elders and sisters, now go home and find your purpose. Follow those patterns, and the Lord will guide you because you're looking for your purpose and follow it. And then the jolting part was when Janine and I returned from Mexico, we looked at each other and we thought, wow, I guess we need to take our own advice and find our purpose. And for the first little while we were home, our purpose was to take care of Janine's mom, who died a few months later, and my mom, who died a short time after that. That was our purpose at the time. And then we looked at each other and we said, well, what's our purpose? What do we need to do? And she suggested that maybe we could follow up with the brother in Salt Lake we'd worked with on getting our missionary in Mexico out of jail, and call him and see, well, just throw our hat in the ring and say, where do you need us? And initially the idea was that we would go to Accra, Ghana. And a short time later, we got a call back and said, well, would you go to Nairobi, Kenya? Certainly, we'll go. And as soon as we got there, we realized why we're in Nairobi, and that is that one of the projects that the Office of General Counsel was working on was getting the church legalized for the first time in Equatorial Guinea. And by chance or coincidence, or not coincidence at all, Equatorial Guinea is the only country in Africa where Spanish is the official language.
Hmm.
And I speak Spanish from my 2 prior missions. And the brother in charge of the Office of General Counsel there in Nairobi says, well, here's your assignment. And we felt very, very clearly that we were where the Lord needed us, and it had happened that way, and the timing was that way. And again, we felt a sense of purpose from day one when we arrived in Nairobi.
Uh,
And I don't even know where to start to talk about how wonderful the people were there. The saints in Africa in general, and Kenya specifically, are so full of faith. They love Jesus. They talk about Jesus. You go to church meetings, it's about Jesus. It's not about other topics. They have testimonies. And I heard it said, and I really think this is true, that Christians in the Western world believe in Christ, but Christians in Africa depend on Christ.
mhm.
And these people would pray in the morning that the Lord would help them find a way to work and to have money to pay to feed their children that night. And that's the kind of faith that they exhibit, very real. And I learned so much more from them watching how they live the gospel than I could have ever thought to have taught them with my words. They taught me with their actions and their just absolute faithfulness. And I think I became converted by watching how converted they were. It was just fantastic. I just don't have words to describe it. But even the Kenyans who aren't members of the church, you could talk to Jesus about Jesus with anyone. We had the joke in Mexico that every taxi driver in Mexico had a Book of Mormon. In Kenya, we had the joke that every waiter and waitress had a Book of Mormon because, we could talk about the gospel with everyone. And there's a young man we'd met who was our waiter at dinner one night. Long story short, after dinner, I gave him a Bible, and then I said, I've got another book here called Another Testament of Jesus Christ. Would you like this too? We also call it the Book of Mormon, and he was thrilled to have both books in his hands. And he is now has his mission papers in. I was blessed to go back a few months ago to Africa working on that project even after my mission, and while I was there, I was able to ordain him an elder, and before too long, he'll be out in the mission field himself. A waiter we met,
Wow.
and that's just how receptive people are to the gospel, and that kid, I call him Peter the Miracle Magnet because he just experiences miracles everywhere he goes, and it's just his faith, and it inspires me.
Mm.
Yeah, it just does. That story could be repeated over and over with different names.
What a treasure trove of love that you developed for a people. And it speaks to you, Jeff, as the type of person you are when you said that it's not what you did for them, it's ultimately what they did for you and how you changed as a person because of who they are and how they depended on the Savior, Jesus Christ. I just think that's amazing. And that's a perfect segue into one of the last questions here, and that is, you've seen a lot of senior missionaries serve. It's interesting. Young missionaries know, maybe 18, 19, 20, 21. Those are the years where there's a certain, I don't like to use the word expectation, especially after our conversation about being ready, but there certainly is a time there where it makes sense for people to make that decision. Am I going to go serve or not? But when you're a senior, there's really no age. There's no age where they say, okay, at the age of 55 or 60 or 65 or whatever the age, this is when you need to start. What would you tell those missionaries who haven't set a day for themselves yet, but they're thinking, well, I'd like to serve when I get older? What advice would you give, unsolicited advice, to anyone out there who's considering a senior mission?
Well, I would tell you this story about some dear friends who served in Nairobi with us, a senior missionary couple who were in their 80s. We celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary together with a bunch of senior missionaries. She was the area mental health advisor, and she had quite a job with, I think, 17 countries of missionaries and walking them through some difficulties of, the kinds of things that young missionaries experience. And her husband was her able assistant, and he had not served a mission as a young man. They got married at a young age, and he was thrilled to be serving his first mission as an 81-year-old. And the joy of his involvement and participating with him and seeing the joy in him spread joy to me. We served in an orphanage school every other weekend, and this brother would go with us, and he could just hardly wait. At Christmas time, he bought a case of oranges to give every child there an orange because that's what he thought a child should have for Christmas. I mean, we got to serve with so many people who inspired us just by their goodness and their kindness, these fellow senior missionaries. And it was fun too. We had a different experience working in an area office where there are a bunch of couples to work with. Some senior missionaries work all by themselves off on an island somewhere, supporting a little branch or those sorts of things. And everybody's experience will be different. But I think the greatest thing about being a senior missionary is you get to be 24/7 with your spouse, your companion of choice. And if you do it right, like I think we did, I think you come home loving your wife or your husband so much more than you did before you left because you've seen them in all different circumstances and seen just how genuinely good and great they are. And that's how I felt about it. I love Janine more now than ever because of our shared experiences, sharing the gospel. And it's not just a piece of cake. You know that. There are difficulties, there are hard things, there's challenges of being away from home. But I can honestly say that our family was blessed in many, many ways by our absence. And it's just, we set the stage, and our grandkids know that missions are important to us. And I think that'll help them when the time comes for them to prepare, that they'll want to prepare. Kind of like I told you before about how my dad inspired me. I hope that our service will inspire our grandkids. And we show them pictures of Africa and Mexico. And I don't know how excited they are to see the slideshows, but I'm happy to show them.
Yeah, show anybody who will watch them. I love your heart. You have a heart that says, I just want to serve and I want to be there to help people. And the Lord's helped you, your parents helped you. There are people who are in the crossroads of your life that were there for you. And it sounds like your goal is to always be there for others. So, as a final question. I guess this is something that we generally ask, but you come at it with a significant amount of wisdom and experience and leadership in the church. So as you time travel, span your missions from San Antonio to Peru to Mexico to Nairobi and several other things in between, what advice would you give to those return missionaries, senior or junior, that are returning home and starting to pick up and write those next chapters in life? You talked about purpose. What else would you offer to them and helping them to navigate their next chapters?
When I would receive new missionaries in Mexico, and they come at all different levels of confidence from the MTC in Mexico City. Some were ready to go and some were scared to death. You have that private interview with every new missionary. And I would tell you what I said there because that's the same advice I would give to someone after a mission. I would ask them, "Why are you here?" And they'd say, "Well, I got called here." "Yeah, but why are you here now?" And they'd kind of look at me funny and I'd say, "Well, this is when the Lord called me." They had a basic idea. And I'd say, well, what is it you want to accomplish today as a missionary here, right now? And they'd look at me like, wow, what are you talking about? And I said, well, who does know that? It's obvious where I'm going with this, Sid, right? And the answer was that you could pray and the Lord would tell you. And so it was like, okay, we'll go home and pray about it tonight. And then, I said, well, why don't we pause right now and just have a silent prayer? And I'd tell a quick story about how I'd received an answer, very specific. Maybe you have time. It's a quick one. When I was bishop years ago, when we had 3-hour church, in the middle hour, I had an interview and the lady left the interview and I had about 10 minutes left before priesthood meeting would start. I closed the door of the office. I started looking through my calendar and then I thought, well, what do I do now? And then the thought hit me, well, just kneel down. And I said, Lord, where do you need me? And a very clear answer says, go to the parking lot. And I'd learned from prior experience that meant go to the parking lot. Don't ask further questions. I didn't know the details or what I was supposed to do or say. But I got to the parking lot and I saw a man leaving the church walking toward his car. And I called out to him and approached him and we chatted, a friendly conversation, not where are you going, why are you leaving? It was, I don't know, talking about the football game at the high school the last night or whatever it was. And then I looked at my watch. I said, hey, I got to go. I got to get to priesthood meeting. And I turned around and walked into the church and he followed me in. And I realized that many years ago that the Lord knew where that man was in that parking lot. And he knew where I was willing to approach the man in the parking lot. And that the Lord could put the two of us together for something great to happen. I never did find out if that guy was going to go home and never come back. It didn't matter, because he followed me back into the church. So I'd tell that quick story to my missionaries, and then I'd say, what did I learn from that? And what do you learn from that? Well, what I learned, several things. Lord knows where we are and so forth. But I also learned that when we ask a specific question, what do you need me to do right now? Or, ready, Lord, I've got 10 minutes. Where do you need me for 10 minutes? He would answer that question very quickly and very specifically. And then I'd look at my missionary and say, why don't you right now quietly pray for no more than 15 seconds and ask the question, what do I need to do today to serve thee or to be a better missionary? And I promise you in the name of the Lord that he will tell you something. And then I don't want you to tell me what it is that he told you. It's none of my business, really. It's between you and him. So without fail, I'd say 99% of them would bow their head and say a silent prayer, and they'd open their eyes 15 seconds later, look at me, and they'd say, well, now I know. And I'd say, well, great. When are you going to do it? When are you going to act upon it? And they'd say, well, I will today. And I said, well, how about when you kneel down to pray tonight, you give an accounting to the Lord of what you did with that revelation. And then tomorrow morning, repeat the process. And tomorrow night, kneel down and pray and give an accounting of what you did. And you establish that pattern. Who would you be within a week's time if you did that every day? And they go, wow. Who would you be in a month or 2 years from now when you get on a plane going home? Your family's going to look at you and say, what happened to him? Well, what happened to him or her is that the Spirit taught every day. You followed the promptings every day, and the Lord guided you exactly to where you needed to be. And then, this is the shocker, Sid, I'd say, so elder or sister, what you need to do, here's my advice, until you get married. And they'd look at me like, what do you mean in our first interview in the mission field, you're talking about marriage? I says, yes, I am. You pray that prayer until you get married. And then the prayer changes to, what do we need to do today? And then when you come to the end of your life and you stand before the Lord and he says, well, what did you do, Jeff, with your life? You can honestly say, I did what you told me to do every day to the best of my ability. I tried to be true and faithful. And then you will feel joyful at the end of your life. So Sid, that's a long way to answer your short question. What advice would I give to every returning missionary? I'd say do just that. Every day, follow the pattern you learned on your mission to pray to the Lord, to seek his spirit, and do one thing at a time. Don't fill your bowl with spaghetti noodles of complicated, twisted up, all kinds of lists of 49 things you have to do. Just one thing at a time. What does the Lord need me to do today to be a better man, to be a better woman, to be a better servant, to be a better disciple? And he will answer that question, act upon it, report in your prayers, and he'll guide your life to a life of happiness.
That's beautiful. I'm writing this down. I've gone where you wanted me to go, dear Lord. I am where you want me to be, dear Lord. Now, what do you want me to do? Pray, get the answer, go do, return the report, and then go to the next one. I love that.
Pray the prayer, Lord, I got 10 minutes. Where do you want me?
Jeff, we have been so richly blessed. Thank you. And thank you to your amazing companion who's not here with us today. I need to recognize her. She's a big part of who you are at this point, because for so many years, you've been saying, where do you want us to go? And you've done just that. And you couldn't do it alone. So my friend, congratulations to you on marrying a wonderful companion. We appreciate your time. We love you. We've never met in person. We're in different states, but I consider you a hero in my life now, Jeff. Thank you for all that you do and all that you are.
Thanks for your kind words. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
We hope you enjoyed today's program. It is our sincere hope that you gain insights from these lived experiences of disciples of Jesus Christ as you navigate your next chapters in life. We look forward to having you join us each week for the unfolding chapters of our guests. Remember to follow us on Instagram at RMNextChapters for announcements and updates. Also, you can visit us on our website at rmnextchapters.com, where you can listen to each podcast directly or link to your favorite podcasting platform. As always, if you have any thoughts or feedback, we'd love to hear it. Please send them to sid@rmnextchapters.com. See you soon.